Welcome, everybody. As a conference chair and CIES president-elect, I would like to welcome the very first plenary session of CIES 2021. We're happy to welcome Kavita Ramdas and Wanjiru Kamau-Rutenberg to today's session. They'll talk about negotiating the deeply entrenched power dynamics of the world of philanthropy from the perspective of an activist and an advocate dedicated to social justice. Tomorrow, Gayatri Spivak will be our plenary speaker, and on Wednesday, John Powell at the same time as today. Kathryn Muller will introduce today's speakers and chair the session. Emily Anderson will help with the chat, so please put your questions and comments there. Before I hand over the floor to Kathryn, we also want to thank our ASL interpreters today, Kyle and Rodney. And as you know, the session's being recorded and it'll be posted on the CIES YouTube channel later. So Kathryn Muller will chair the session. She's an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a recognized scholar in the gender and education area with her recent book, The Gender Effect: Capitalism, Feminism, and the Corporate Politics of Development. Kathryn?
Thank you so much, Karen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining us from around the world. I'm so honored to be here today for the opening keynote of our meeting dedicated to the question of social responsibility. I'm joining from Madison, Wisconsin in the US on the occupied ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk people. On behalf of the programs committee, including Jose Cosa, Emily Anderson, and Sangeeta Kamat, I would like to thank Karen Monkman for her leadership in designing the program and keynotes for this conference. Our committee has sought to respond to the demands of the world, from the movement for Black lives and Indigenous and feminist movements around the globe, for leadership and scholarly work that attends to unequal relations of power in our educational systems and at the core of our global capitalist economy. The keynote today, focused on power, philanthropy, and global justice, is the first of 3 keynotes that center feminist and anti-racist scholars and practitioners. Our hope is that it inspires CIES to put questions of power, justice, and inequality across multiple axes of difference, including race, ethnicity, class, caste, gender and sexuality, nation, language, religion, and coloniality at the center of our work together. I cannot think of 2 individuals more perfect to lead us in this conversation today than Kavita Ramdas and Dr. Wanjiru Kamau-Rutenberg. I will first introduce Kavita, and then following her talk, I will introduce Wanjiru. It is my pleasure to welcome Kavita Ramdas, who is joining us from New York City today. Kavita is a recognized global advocate for intersectional gender equity and justice. She currently serves as the director of the Women's Rights Program at the Open Society Foundations. She previously served as strategy advisor for Madre and founded KNR Sisters, an independent consulting venture. From 1996 to 2010, she led the Global Fund for Women as president and CEO to grow into the largest public foundation for women's rights in the world. From 2012 to 2016, she led the Ford Foundation's operations in South Asia and was senior advisor to Darren Walker, the foundation's president. She founded CIES, the Social Entrepreneurs in Residence program at Stanford University, and is a member of Aspen Institute's Henry Crown Fellows program. Currently, Kavita serves on a few select nonprofit advisory boards, the board of trustees of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, and a board of directors of GRIST, a publicly supported journalism nonprofit focused on climate justice. I first met Kavita over a decade ago during my research on global philanthropy. She struck me then as one of the most critical voices in philanthropy, a leader who was not afraid to publicly speak out against the abuses of the most powerful companies, institutions, and nations on the planet, and to work in solidarity with marginalized communities all over the world. Kavita, thank you for joining us today to share your work and insights into the learning and unlearning we must do in the midst of escalating violence, increasing inequality, a devastating pandemic, rising authoritarianism around the world, and a climate emergency. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kathryn, for that very warm and caring welcome. Salams, namastes, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever this may find you in your day. I'm honored and grateful to have been invited to address this wonderfully diverse and far-flung group of educators and advocates for international education. Thanks so much to the organizers, particularly members of the Keynote Planning Group. That includes my dear colleague, Kathryn Muller, and her fellow organizers, Karen Monkman, Sangeeta Kamath, Jose Cossa, and Emily Anderson. The title of this talk was inspired by a series of reflections that I have had over the years around the challenges we face in our efforts to move towards more just, equitable, and open societies. If we are to talk about the power dynamics of philanthropy and global justice, and to interrogate the limits and possibilities for challenging the status quo and advancing a more radical vision of an intersectional feminist future, it strikes me that we will need to paraphrase Maria in The Sound of Music and start at the very beginning. My comments today will begin with a few reflections, first on philanthropy, then on what we mean by our current global community within which we all belong, and will end with some thoughts about the role of both philanthropy and education in helping to shift, challenge, and reimagine the future. I am so looking forward to time to further unpack some of this thinking with Wanjiru, also a dear friend from many years, and Kathryn at the end of my comments. Philanthropy. Is it the love of humanity, or is it a slave to capital? For philanthropy in Greek doesn't have a dollar, yen, or rupee sign attached to it. It simply means love of humankind. Yet that is not what it has come to mean at all. What is philanthropy in the 21st century, and what are we to do with it? The bottom line is that today's private philanthropy exists because of market capitalism. We are dealing with a reality in which incredibly wealthy people are made to be able to sit comfortably with their obscene levels of wealth, while receiving tax benefits and public accolades for helping society. Post the recent pandemic, those levels of gross inequality have gotten steadily worse. In statistics from a recent piece in The Guardian by Bernie Sanders, in the wealthiest nation in the world today, half of all Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. 500,000 of the very poorest of them are homeless. Millions are worried about evictions. 92 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured, and families all across the country are worried about how to feed their children. Yes, this country has a hunger problem. Most obscenely, perhaps, low-income Americans now have life expectancies that are about 15 years lower than the wealthy. Poverty, in other words, in America has become a death sentence. Meanwhile, the people on the top have never had it so good. The top 1% now own more wealth than the bottom 92%. And the 50 wealthiest Americans own more wealth than the bottom half of American society, 165 million people. While millions of Americans have lost their jobs and incomes during the pandemic, over the past year, 650 billionaires have watched their wealth increase by over $1.3 trillion. These are numbers we can barely begin to comprehend. This phenomena of inequality is, of course, not new. A generation of robber barons in the US that included millionaires like Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, etc., made huge profits and fortunes. Rockefeller became the US's first billionaire with a fortune worth nearly 2% of the national economy, and spent much of the last 40 years of his life at Kaikit, his estate in Westchester County, where the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, on whose board I currently serve, still holds meetings. He is basically given the compliment of having defined much of the structure of modern philanthropy in the United States, along with other key industrialists such as the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie. In the US, enabling private wealth to accumulate and to be shared via personal private philanthropy, rather than by using government to redistribute wealth via progressive taxation policies, as has been more common in Europe, has continued to be the dominant frame for giving. In Anand Giridharadas's book, Winners Take All, he calls this ethos market world, made up of people who want to, quote, do well and do good. Like the dieter who would rather do anything to lose weight than actually eat less, this business elite wants to save the world through social impact investing, entrepreneurship, sustainable capitalism, philanthrocapitalism, artificial intelligence, and all kinds of other market-driven solutions. Joe Stiglitz, the economist, said, in order to really have an economy with the greatest opportunity for all, the kind of economy they seem to champion, these market worlders would actually have to pay high levels of corporate and personal income tax, offer decent wages to their workers, allow unions, fund public schools instead of their pet charter projects, and support some form of single-payer healthcare and campaign finance reform. Instead, as corporate chief executives now make over 300 times their average employees' wages, the average American worker now actually earns $32 less a week than he or she did 48 years ago, after adjusting for inflation. At Davos and other international conclaves where the CEOs celebrate the new economic world that they have helped to create, which has also rewarded them so amply, they move seamlessly from sessions discussing risks of climate change, growing inequality, and financial instability to dinners where they praise tax cuts for billionaires and corporations and applaud proposals for deregulation. It seems that cognitive dissonance is intrinsic to the survival of this species. One cannot arrive at a more economically equal reality when the rungs of the ladder are so profoundly far apart. Democracy and high levels of inequality of the kind that are now marking not just the United States, but more and more countries around the world are simply incompatible. Very rich people will always use their money to maintain political and economic power. But in a way, what Giridharas's book points out is that there are many of us, the unwitting enablers, many of us in philanthropy, believing we are working for a better world, at best chipping away at margins, making slight course corrections while the system goes on uninterrupted. The subtitle of the book says it all, the elite charade of changing the world. In many ways, this field, the field I have spent much of my life in, philanthropy, enables the myth that we are about social change, about transformation, about challenging the status quo, when in fact, perhaps all we are about is providing a pressure valve for capitalism that allows, as Anand would put it, the plutes to continue to plute. Does this mean then that I have no hope for philanthropy? No. Otherwise, I should have left it a long time ago. I do believe it can play a role and that many of us who work inside it can find ways to move resources to those who need them most, even to those who are boldly radical in their intent and revolutionary in their organizing spirit and objectives. But I think to do that, we have to be very clear-eyed about our roles inside a space that is neither radical nor revolutionary. It is a space, rather, that mirrors the dominant class of society that we live in. AKA, it is disproportionately a space controlled by wealthy white men. So, if we do choose to participate in it, not simply to benefit from its better pay, decent benefits, and comfortable working conditions, but to choose to be a change agent, we must do so knowing that we intend to play the role of a subversive inside a decidedly non-radical space. And that is challenging, as many of us who think of ourselves as progressives in philanthropy can attest to. A recent report by two organizations, Echoing Green and Bridgespan, on racial justice, or dare I say lack thereof, pointed out that 92% of foundation presidents and 83% of full-time staff members are white. In general, 3/4 of white people have entirely white social networks. How do you get connected to the decision makers? Asked a co-author of the report. If those peer networks are largely white and you're not in those networks, how do you get in? It reminds me of an interview that I had before joining the Global Fund for Women. I was asked how I would possibly be successful at raising money inside Silicon Valley since I didn't know any rich people. These experiences have held true for women-led organizations and women-led organizations and their challenges finding funding. Organizations like the Women's Funding Network have demonstrated time and again that less than 7% of total private foundation giving in the US goes to organizations led by and primarily focused on advancing the rights of women and girls. Leaders of Black Lives Matter, one of the most visible movements for racial justice in the United States, have shared countless depressing stories about how funding for racial justice in the aftermath of this incredibly successful global movement is often used as window dressing, while resources still flow unequally, or how actually grants have been pulled because of the positions that BLM took on issues like Palestinian rights. Most recently, in the aftermath of the horrific shootings of Asian women in Atlanta, API advocacy groups shared statistics showing how limited the resources for API communities are in the US. Foundation funding accounts for essentially 20 cents on the dollar, or for every $100 awarded by a foundation, 20 cents is designated for API communities. The story for it's not 20 cents on the dollar, it's actually less than that. It's 20 cents for every $100. The story for Native Americans is even worse. These are the reasons that colleagues like Edgar Villanueva, who wrote Decolonizing Philanthropy, and Vanessa Daniels, CEO of the Groundswell Fund, argue in a recent Chronicle of Philanthropy article that it is way past time to call out philanthropy so white. Democratizing philanthropy is not impossible. There are publicly supported funds, feminist funds, BIPOC-led funds that raise money and give it away. If private donors really wanted to bring an egalitarian frame to their grant making, they could choose to endow and build the capacity of such community-supported organizations closer to the ground, using participatory grant-making techniques, and often more willing to support smaller, edgier organizations and/or groups that are not even formally registered. That is what funding movements takes, and it is not often what a large private philanthropy can do. Now to the questions of a global community. A global community of equals or a power dynamic of have and have-nots? The inequality within countries that I've just raised in the context of the United States is, alas, replicated across the global community. Despite progress in some countries, income and wealth are increasingly concentrated at the top. A recent UN report notes that the share of income going to the richest 1% of the global population increased in 46 out of 57 countries from 1990 to 2015. Meanwhile, the bottom 40% earned less than 25% of income in all 92 countries with data. This is from the United Nations in 2019. At the level of education, gaps in learning outcomes are large and persistent. Inequalities that have historical roots, whether in caste or race or ethnicity or gender, often continue even after the conditions that first generated them change. Members of groups that suffered from discrimination in the past not only start off with fewer assets and lower levels of social and human capital, but these disparities in health and education make it challenging, if not impossible, for people to break out of the cycle of poverty, leading to the transmission of disadvantage from one generation to the next. We have seen this play out in the United States painfully and visibly within the Black community. A structural form of exclusion and discrimination grounded in white supremacy, manifested in racist policies and practice, including in educational policies and practice, have been clear. Heather McGhee's searing new book, The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs All of Us, reveals how this has worked. The commitment to a publicly funded higher education was as common in the United States from as early as the 1860s, when the US government offered the states 10 million acres of land, taken, of course, from indigenous peoples on whose ground we stand here in Manhattan as well, to build or sell for institutions of higher citizens for their citizens, of higher education for their citizens. In 1976, state governments provided 6 out of every $10 it costs students to attend public colleges. The remainder meant that most white Americans paid a modest tuition and had access to federal Pell Grants. As she notes, this massive public investment was not considered charity. States saw returns of $3 to $4 for every dollar invested in a public college. When the public meant white people, public colleges thrived. This, alas, is no longer the case. Students of color were once one out of six of every student in a public college. Today, they make up more than 45% of all students. During this period of transformation, demographic change in the United States, and greater voice and political power for those who had been excluded, public investments in state schools have fallen steadily, leading to a situation where college tuition has tripled, making up now the majority of expenses for state colleges, and student debt accordingly is now a staggering $1.5 trillion. To quote Heather, this represents a stealth privatization of America's public colleges. Other things in the United States have been similarly privatized. Corporations essentially no longer paying taxes of anything, of any kind on anything, leading for a call most recently by Federal Chairwoman Janet Yellen for global corporate taxation policies. Unfortunately, in the rest of the world, there hasn't even been a pretense of stealth. Global capitalism has come in the guise of development advice from institutions like the World Bank and the IMF, who urged poor countries like the one I was born into in India to cut food subsidies, to cut healthcare subsidies, and encourage the privatization of education, even at the K through 12 levels, not to mention at higher educational levels. This in some of the world's most vulnerable populations. And we have watched as the greed of individuals and the valorization of profit have been held up as the mechanisms for progress and competitiveness. Yet the hypocrisy of this alleged free market has been exposed time and again, most recently by the ravages of COVID-19, which stripped bare the nations where a failure to invest in the caring sectors of the economy have and are still decimating those who most need healthcare, education, and childcare for their very survival. Across the continent of Africa, much of Asia, and in many poorer nations of Latin America and Central America, governments that once followed these structural adjustment regimes in order to avail of precious loans and capital investments from global North financial institutions eviscerated their own public investments for the well-being of their own people. It is that history that informs our realities today. It is that history that makes it possible for a single individual to have a net worth that is many times that of a nation. It is that reality that makes it possible for the Gates Foundation to meet with and pressure senior government officials of various African nations into making choices for education and health and agriculture in Africa that are not driven by local communities or by local needs or by local priorities, much less local knowledge and wisdom. It is that reality that has been driving these decisions much before philanthropy at the scale of a Gates. It was true about the Green Revolution in India, which was driven by Ford and Rockefeller, with little sense of what the environmental impact would be or the social impact of moving towards ever greater farms and consolidation of land, while small, mainly lower caste farmers suffered or vanished altogether. And it is that reality, I believe, that we must be willing to look at together as we seek to imagine or reimagine another world. For the claims about development, as we now know, have been false ones. This model of endless consumption, like the model of endless war, also driven by market forces, has not brought us to a good place. The earth is reeling from these levels of consumption, from the increase in meat eating, methane levels now at historic highs, amongst the new middle classes across the planet, all of whom aspire to Western consumption levels. From cars and planes that are emitting carbon into the atmosphere to the constant pressure on water across the planet. I could go on and on. The point is not that we have a population program, that we have a population problem, excuse me. The point is that we cannot do so when we support 9 billion people who want to eat, drink, live, and consume at the rate of an average middle-class household in the United States, which it has come to believe it is entitled to. We face that challenge with a level of entitlement that is killing the earth, and that is what will take us all down with it. We face a new set of challenges as extreme inequality meets those levels of entitlement on the one hand, and the aspirations of people who were until very recently desperately poor on the other. Why, ask the Chinese and Indian citizens who have only recently begun to enjoy higher levels of consumption, should we be asked to make cuts to our living standards to address climate change when the West has been enjoying those standards for decades? Grappling with those deep divisions between those who have and those who have not, and the formerly had nots who are now driving economic change, is going to make wise choices increasingly difficult within our deeply divided global community. So, what should educators like all of you on this interesting set of conversations for these next few days be thinking about? What should we be doing in this global standoff? And can philanthropy help? I am struck at the ease with which we use that term global, as though we all know what it means. And yet, the true implications of what that term means are profoundly lost, particularly here in the global north, where most foundation and donor communities are still disproportionately clustered. We are at a moment in history where we have no choice but to consider the world as a whole as the only appropriate unit of analysis. The totally devastating pandemic that we are still experiencing is just the most recent and the most humbling face of the multiple ways in which Mother Earth has told us that her biggest challenges can simply no longer be defined by the artificial political boundaries that we have chosen for ourselves. Every one of the big challenges that we face together as a global community, whether it's climate change, militarization, poverty, or disease, are fundamentally global in nature. They are produced by forces that transcend these narrow boundaries based on race or ethnicity or gender, and they can only be solved at a global level. For me, education offers the only real hope of meeting and overcoming these global challenges. But, and this is where the how we do education becomes so critical, this education has to be imaginative, inclusive, and fully cognizant of the deep inequalities of the world, especially the persistence of structural forms of inequality, such as those of race, caste, and gender. Finally, there are inherent risks in our pursuit of a global education agenda. The inbuilt values and assumptions, which will be projected consciously or unconsciously, can and will have both good and bad consequences. For me, a truly liberal global education might also need to be one that consciously aspires to be intersectionally feminist, opening our world to possibilities hitherto unimagined. We're having this conversation at a time when the pandemic has been completely contained in China, where it first originated, while it races out of control in India, a similarly huge nation in which rapid economic growth has created huge social tensions, as those excluded from the wealth evident all around them express their resentment, anger, and vulnerability in farmer strikes and movements, including Maoist resistance amongst landless laborers and impoverished peasants. In my own life, I shuttle between multiple realities. My in laws live in Pakistan, my family is in India, and our 3 decades of marriage, living mainly in the United States, has revealed profoundly the depressing impact of a narrow nationalism that has sought to unravel centuries of a shared culture by building fences, walls, and weapon inventories. The Indian middle class has blindly followed the politics of hate under Modi, even as it pours into expensive shopping malls to purchase junk food and throw its trash into mounting piles of non-degradable plastic in the streets of Mumbai and Delhi. Yet neither Hindutva nationalism nor rampant consumerism have saved it from the coronavirus. We could use India as an example or Asia as an example, but the analysis, applies to all parts of the world. The pandemic that originated in India has affected the whole world. India's lethal second wave is already having a huge impact on the production of vaccines and the ability of African nations to adequately respond to the virus. On a more basic level, sustaining current consumption patterns, particularly in the United States, but also Europe, not to mention those of the growing middle classes of China and India, will require ever increasing extraction of natural resources globally, even as we talk about Paris, even as we talk about climate change, and without much concern for either the well being of the environment or the peoples living there. The case for thinking and acting globally may seem obvious, and yet I would submit that it's going to take a lot for us to challenge these long entrenched ideas. Yes, the Trump administration's bellicose assertions of America first echo in my ears, but it was not the first time that a US administration has asserted the need to be first. President Obama said in 2010, they're making serious investments in clean energy because they want those jobs. Well, I do not accept second place for the United States of America. What I'd like to suggest to all of us and to those American presidents is that to think globally with our planet as the unit of analysis means we cannot think anymore in linear terms. You can only be first or second if your imagination has you standing in a long line. The United States does not need to be first, neither does India or Germany or China. We could stand in a circle, the same circle that our globe literally manifests for us. The circle does not have firsts or seconds, and it must replace the line in our educational values and principles if we are to survive the kinds of threats that climate change and pandemics pose to our very existence. So, what do we do as educators and change makers? I submit we have some serious unlearning to do. Unlearning about power and privilege, unlearning about structural discrimination and the ways in which it is entrenched in our ways of understanding our neighbors and one another. Unlearning about whether the forces we assume are there to protect, AKA the police, are actually a source of terror and fear for many of our fellow citizens. Unlearning about the so-called safety of home, when in fact in this pandemic, but also in times where there is no pandemic, lockdowns and shelter-in-place orders make home a cage for women from which it was often impossible to escape the psychological and physical violence of men facing joblessness, unemployment, and just rage. Unlearning about who is actually necessary to the survival of a planet in a care crisis. Care workers, not CEOs of big companies. Unlearning the disrespect that capitalist economist has accorded to women and girls across the globe who do the bulk of this planet's care work, caring for the earth, her fields, her animals, and yes, her babies, her young, her old, and her sick. Unlearning the notion that work is not work unless it is paid, and remembering that all economic activity on this planet is dependent on the reciprocity of caring for one another. Unlearning our assumptions that we live in a democracy and digging deeper to face the fact that in most of our societies, even the ones we consider to be tolerant or democratic, are lying deeply entrenched systems of power dynamics that reinforce inequality. Unlearning the subtle internalized values of patriarchy, whether we are women, men, or people of other genders, because it has become so entrenched in our culture that it took something like Me Too to force a reckoning. Unlearning the ways in which all of us, regardless of our race or ethnic backgrounds, have unconsciously accepted white supremacy or Han supremacy or upper caste supremacy that defines life in the countries where white people are the dominant power or Han Chinese are the dominant power or upper caste Hindus are the dominant power. When George Floyd pleaded with a knee on his neck to be able to breathe, and it was captured in excruciating agony of 9 minutes and 29 seconds, that was white supremacy announcing that it did not need to fear video cameras or bystanders begging the police for mercy. It took a global movement led by Black Lives Matter, a Black Attorney General in Minnesota, and the painful testimony of eyewitnesses to a public lynching to ensure that for the first time in Minnesota history, a white policeman was convicted of murder on all 3 counts. That work of unlearning bias, racism, sexism, and a host of other forms of hate and intolerance is our work to do, together in the spaces of the academy, but also in our own homes, with our own families and our friends, and in our workplaces, which in my case means philanthropy. For philanthropy has unlearning to do as well. We cannot make, as we did recently in the foundation I work in, a few symbolic grants for racial justice, no matter how large the sum, and feel as though our history of systematically under-resourcing Black organizations and people of color-led organizations or women's rights organizations is now taken care of for good. We cannot claim to be progressives and allow white men to continue to dominate in terms of leadership roles on philanthropic boards, as foundation executives and decision makers, because we are assured by them that somehow there is a system of merit that ensures that they deserve to be there, or they are there because our founder trusts them, etc., etc. We cannot tolerate the continuing and casual sexism and sexual abuse that happens across our field to women and gender non-conforming people. We can begin to recognize that we have literally replicated the private sector ethos of those who are wealth makers inside many philanthropic organizations. Instead of creating spaces of humility and shared learning, we have created daunting barriers. Only in English, give us impact measurements, only online, to those who seek the resources that are so tightly controlled by a few obscenely wealthy people. We can look more closely at the hypocrisy, the conflict of interests that are rampant, the 3-person or all family or all white boards that our grantees would never be able to get away with in a million years. We can begin to reread Martin Luther King and go beyond the I have a dream speech and remember the searing words he had for us. Philanthropy must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic justice which make philanthropy necessary. Those circumstances of injustice are rooted in the economic system that the world has followed blindly into the rabbit hole we find ourselves today. As Gandhi said, there is enough in this world for everyone's need, but not for everyone's greed. Our greed has polluted rivers, extinguished countless species, privatized things that should be human rights for all, like water, education, and health, and is well on course to destroy the last green lungs of the Amazon that keep our planet alive. But, and here is the promise of philanthropy, this harsh reality has also sparked enough outrage and a desire to respond with a new vision. With new imagination, with generosity and creativity and caring, this past year, we have witnessed that there are among us so many ordinary people doing truly extraordinary things. The high school students who organize BLM protests across city and towns and neighborhoods in America. The feminist economist trailblazers talking about a new care economy model. The Ni Una Menos feminists in Argentina who got their government to pass a new law legalizing abortion, but also ensuring 1,000 days of care, healthcare, education, and childcare for all babies born, no matter what their economic circumstances. The teenage climate justice warriors from known names like Greta Thunberg to thousands across the planet whose names we may never know. To the movement organizers of domestic workers here in the US and across the globe who are demanding recognition for their care labor in our homes and dignity and respect for their struggles as workers. If it wants to, philanthropy can invest in these amazing people doing the work of caring for the world. It can do so without making them jump through hoops. It can do so with respect for them as partners in a common enterprise. It can open itself to lessons from the communities that it serves, rather than to the whims of those who made the money in the economy that we now know is neither just nor fair nor driven by markets alone. It can choose to stand with rather than bestow upon. It can open its endowments wider. The same people making 23% in the stock market can give a lot more than the 5% that is required by the law. It can hire differently and more creatively. It can walk its talk on diversity, equity, and inclusion by changing how it looks, whom it funds, and how it gives. And it has been put on notice. The people have a right to breathe, and they will. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kavita, for your really powerful words. It's my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Wanjiru Kamau-Rutenberg to our conversation. She is joining us from Nairobi today. Wanjiru is the Director of African Women in Agricultural Research and Development, known as AWARD, Previously, she founded and was executive director of Kavita, an award-winning leadership incubator that invests in high-achieving women from under-resourced families who are passionate about driving change in their communities. She is a 2018 Tutu Fellow, has been honored as a champion of change by the Obama White House, named one of 100 most influential Africans by New African magazine, recognized as a Ford Foundation Champion of Democracy, awarded a United Nations Intercultural Innovation Award, and named one of Kenya's top 40 women under age 40. Dr. Kamau-Rutenberg holds a PhD and master's degree in political science from the University of Minnesota, a bachelor's degree in politics, and a doctorate of humane letters from Whitman College. I first met Wanjiru when she was the executive director of Kavita, one of the most innovative and transformative programs for young women I have come across in my work. Wanjiru's leadership of Kavita and award demonstrate how one can powerfully lead when they place young people at the center of their work and ensure that NGOs are first and foremost accountable to the communities they serve rather than the changing desires of donors. Wanjiru, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be here.
So I thought we would start by thinking about questions of power, the power of philanthropy to determine policy. So Wanjiru, as we've discussed before, across the world, we have evidence that foundations like the Gates Foundation and other philanthropic and corporate actors are driving national level education policies, public health policies, and setting broader global agendas. They are often also the principal funders and architects of public-private partnerships with ministries of education, like we are seeing in countries like Liberia today. What are your concerns about this disproportionate influence of philanthropy? And in the context of limited or decreasing state resources, how do you protect public education and other public systems from these anti-democratic influences? From your perspective, what systems need to be put into place to ensure that philanthropic money is not determining national policies and global agendas?
Thank you. Such good questions. Let's see if I can chunk them out. But before I even get started, Kavita, that was just amazing. I've got goosebumps. I just feel like Kavita actually answered it all. There's so much of what she said that I would just want to highlight in my reflections on this question. First is a question of democracy. And I think the biggest challenge with philanthropy shaping policy is actually a question of democracy. Do the people who will ultimately be impacted by these policies, what is their voice? And what does it mean when their voice matters so little, especially for because money does matter, and Kavita did such a great job of showing us how it has mattered through history and how philanthropic money is mattering and shaping things now. So for me, the biggest concern is around what are the implications on democracy? And here, let me kind of dive in a bit deeper, thinking as a political scientist. When I talk about democracy, I'm not talking about elections in particular kind of particular shapes and forms that we then call democracy, which for a lot of us in places like the African continent, we've been told you must run elections, and if you have elections there, well, then you're democratic. And the cracks of that assumption are incredibly visible. I actually want to pull back out to a global scale and look at the ways that the very ideas of a people collectively determining their fate is under huge contest. We are at a global moment of contestation of the idea of democracy. And philanthropy has played into undermining ideas of democracy by showing so many of the world's poor population that whoever has the most money calls a tune. So there's that historical piece. Let me try and also, it was such a great multi-layered question. What are some of the systems that need to be put in place? Again, I go back to how do we make sure people power really is the ultimate, the buck stops at people power. And I would reframe that to say, what are those democratic systems? In what ways can we emerge and craft ways that democratic systems can actually put a check on philanthropy's seemingly unchecked power? And just like Kavita ended her remarks in saying, I am actually hopeful for the possibility of reshaping philanthropy. And a lot of that is what happens when we build social movements that can hold philanthropy in check. No power is absolute, ever. I'm sure some philosopher said that somewhere. If they didn't, I just said it. There's no power that is absolute. All power is constrained in some way, shape, or form. And when it comes to philanthropic power, I do think the equation then rests between money and people. However much money can be balanced. And I think the US experiment with Trump was an interesting one. Ultimately, Americans seem to have squeaked by with, a billionaire's wishes to dismantle entire institutions didn't, fully fly in 4 years. But I think that American experiment left a lot of us worried for the state of democracy than we were. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much. Kavita, do you want to jump in?
No, I completely agree with Wanjiru, and I'm grateful for her comments on actually calling out democracy, because I think the problem, I think, is that we have now gotten to this level of, as I said, cognitive dissonance, in which we can say the words democracy while we literally have an economic system that makes it impossible for us to have any semblance of real democracy. And so we're selling kind of a vision of democracy that is not grounded in any kind of notion of an economic democracy. We have the pretend political frameworks for that democracy without the underlying economic structure that can support it.
I would also I would also come back in and remind us that nationalism is not democracy. And it can be, because then the other thing that's happening is at the global level, you're seeing people saying, we want to determine policies at our national level. Whoever billionaire out there can't come and tell us how we should run our agriculture system, our education system. But then for a lot of our countries, some might argue what's happening in India, Tanzania under Magufuli, then the response has been nationalism, which I would not hold up. I think then at that national level, understanding the ways that nationalism and isolationism then poses real challenges to democracy within the nation, within the country and the nation, if the country does indeed align with the nation. And that's actually where the problem comes in terms of ethnic minorities.
Yeah. Or even on women.
Exactly.
They use the excuse that, oh, this is our culture, it's our traditions, therefore you can't come and intervene.
Exactly. So it's important, even as we're talking about democracy, to distinguish it from nationalism.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this context, I guess I wonder, what are the possibilities then in this context of increasing inequality, right-wing authoritarianism and nationalism? What are the possibilities for transnational feminist, anti-racist solidarities across and between movements and organizations in the global North and the global South to push for more radically democratic and transformative national and global agendas. What are the kind of challenges of solidarities within that context?
I might not be looking at the full historical record, but I would want to argue that we are seeing, I think, now more than ever before, and because of technology, we're seeing more solidarity than we have in decades past. I'm thinking of Black Lives Matter and the fact that an incident that happened in Minnesota, and of course we know it's not just one incident, but the racial tensions and the unfairness, injustice in the US communicated, then led to protests all over the world, seeing where people were able to see not just the racial injustice in the US, but the racial and ethnic injustice in their own countries. So I think we are in a moment that is incredibly rich with possibility for transnational activism, and perhaps more now than in any other generations in the past. When you look at the Arab Spring and what was made possible, what seems to be igniting from one country, but then really is a flame that's ready to go in other countries. Roads Must Fall in South Africa, and the kind of post and anti-colonial conversation that stimulated for the rest of us on the continent and in the UK even. I think I'm seeing this as a moment that's particularly rich for alliances.
Absolutely. Kavita, in your role as the CEO and Executive Director of Global Fund for Women, and now your work at OSF as the head of the women's rights programs, you've been working to direct philanthropic money towards movements, so towards anti-racist movements, towards feminist movements around the world. What have you found are the kind of key challenges to solidarities, and how do you sustain them across unequal relations of power, right? Whether those are racial or class or nation-based. As we think about funding those types of movements, despite these challenges.
I think it's very complicated, honestly. I think when you look at the ways in which even the infrastructure of the global development field has been constructed, there's a disproportionate amount of funding that goes to northern-based international INGOs, whether they work on women's rights or whether they work on anything else. And I think part of the contestation really has been to say, we want more resources to go to local organizations. We don't want, and then things that are called global invariably are all like based in the global north, which I find really interesting. It's like, well, Musawa is a really extraordinary global movement that's looking at women's rights within an Islamic feminist frame. And it is not based in New York or in London. It is based in Malaysia or in Cairo. I think we have to do a lot better in terms of being able to challenge these framings of global as being essentially code for global north. So that's, I think, one very important piece. I think the other is this question that I think Wanjiru already kind of spoke to a little bit, which is, we walk a very fine line between the autocrats and the ultra-nationalists in the so-called developing world or the former third world or the non-Western world, who are very conveniently using, when it suits them, oh, we don't want foreign funding to come in. Meanwhile, it's like, Modi basically wanted to throw Ford Foundation out of India, right? Because, we had given a grant to Tista Setalvad, who was the amazing journalist who took him to task for the genocide that he inflicted on Muslim citizens in the state of Gujarat in 2002. But he used the nationalism rhetoric to say, oh, we should not be taking money from foreign funders. Meanwhile, like literally without breaking step, he's actively searching for foreign investment capital for business. And so I think this is somewhere where we have to also be able to, as people in the space of social change and civil society world, we have to look at the whole world and hold them to account and say, how is it that you're not worried about foreign influence when Amazon and Walmart and Google and Yahoo, Twitter just recently apparently suspended 100 accounts of people who've been criticizing Mr. Modi's response on the COVID issue that just came out this morning. And they took down those tweets because the Indian government said they would throw Twitter out of India otherwise. So we need to be aware, I think, as civil society organizations, that nationalism can be used and twisted for any purpose that it suits us, right? All of a sudden, oh, you can't tell us how whether our women need to have the freedom to keep their own names or to come out as LGBT, because that's not our culture and you're interfering in our culture. So I think the ways in which we build solidarity are both to recognize that, yes, there is huge unequal power between global North-based organizations, even if they call themselves feminist, and global South-based organizations, and that we have to struggle together to be able to actually identify ways in which we build solidarity and we stand together. One interesting example is, I think, in the space of domestic workers, because unlike other unions where, people are like, oh, your jobs over there are taking away our jobs over here, you actually have a movement within which people who are working inside households, primarily providing care work, are creating a global solidarity structure that says you have to be able to acknowledge and look at this work that all of us are doing. And in all cases, it is under-resourced and under-provided for. The other thing I would say, Kathryn, is that we have to be willing to look hard at ourselves. If we are feminists and we're not intersectional feminists, then we are not doing our job as feminists. It's not okay to be like, oh, sisterhood is global, but I'm not going to talk to the lower caste woman who works in my house, or I'm not going to pay her fair because, she makes it possible for me to go and have my feminist job as a lawyer or as a, rocket designer in whatever field I want. So I think for me, those are some initial steps. And then I think on the question of education, I think it's very telling the way Modi has gone after, education, basic education, rewriting history and writing Muslim contributions out of Indian history, saying that the Taj Mahal was actually a Hindu temple. When you start doing things like this, you begin to actually literally reframe the ways in which children grow up with assumptions about who does and does not belong as part of a society. And I think we've seen that in the history of the United States and the ways in which racism and sexism has been embedded. So I think it holds true no matter where we work. So I think we have to begin this work of solidarity building with the kind of humility about the fact that we know that it's going to be hard and that we can't just expect that our colleagues in the global South will automatically just trust us when we say, oh no, we're coming, with humility and we want to work with you. And, I think they have a right to say, well, show us the money then, please, because, our budgets are like a fraction of yours.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we can see how, global philanthropy, particularly in the global North, has really fueled much of the kind of hate that you're describing, Kavita, right? So the Gates Foundation actually awarded and celebrated Modi in the context of this violence, right? And so, where is the accountability?
That's a perfect example.
Where is the accountability in that? Where are, nations and other philanthropists calling out the Gates Foundation for that? And I think, we need more of that. And I guess that brings me to a question of, in studying, philanthropy for kind of global development for, over a decade, it seems like very few people are willing to stand up and to call powerful institutions, foundations, powerful, wealthy individuals to task who are within the field of philanthropy, for fear that their NGO may not be funded or they might lose their job at the fancy foundation. How do we work within the field of philanthropy to create, systems where people can call out without that fear of retribution, and to encourage those in the field to do so boldly? I mean, Kavita, I've watched you do that, and I've watched you be the only person at very important forums where nobody was willing to do that because everyone wanted the invitation next year or the funding flows to continue. So, how that and how can you encourage others to do that as well?
Wanjiru, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Okay, now this is going to sound ridiculously simplistic and just ridiculously practical, but it turns out philanthropists they're not homogeneous, they're not all the same. And so some of what I've found successful is definitely working with those whose interests you're aligned with and whose vision of the world you're aligned with. And letting them compete against each other for your business, which is not a lot of how NGO leaders think. And because we do have a really broken system that is kind of Hunger Games, if you will, within NGOs in the search for philanthropic dollars. But so there's just a real big mind shift that I find successful in terms of, I'm gonna have you guys compete against each other for which one of you gets to work with me in my amazing organization and my amazing work on the ground. And I find when I walk into a room with that attitude, people get surprised. Like, who is this Black woman with that kind of attitude? And they're not used to meeting it. So that's one thing. I mean, it sounds really basic, but I have power starts from within. And so for me, started walking in with power being like, I don't know, do you deserve to work with me? Because I know what we're doing is awesome. That helps me walk into a room with a spine. And the other piece of it is identifying and networking with those folks like Kavita who are progressive within these organizations and aligning and working with them, because a lot of, and it took me time to appreciate that there are a lot of people who actually go into these jobs. It's a lot of times it's not their money. This is a job, and they were very intentional in picking that particular role because they wanted to be in a place to take direct funding to causes that are progressive, pro-democratic, and pro-equality. And so trying to identify who those are and working with them, and then understanding the constraints within which they are working. And so that it becomes a real productive partnership of what is it that you need to navigate within your institution, and how can I write a proposal in a way that that is true, is my truth, our truth on the ground, but also is not gonna get that grant shut down at committee level before it goes further. So those are just real tactical, seemingly small things. But then I think fundamental to that is constantly asking yourself whether it is possible, and asking of philanthropy, whether it is possible to change anything from within. Because once you become a grantee, you are within. Yes, it's a donor-funded relationship, but grantees are within. And there are certain ways that you can actually, once you are within, start to help shift the narrative. So some of what I found useful is being that strong insider outsider voice. You're inside, hey, you guys invited me to come give a talk at your annual meeting, blah, 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 because you think I'm a great grantee. But while I'm in here, I'm going to say some things that I know you internally are not able to say. And that leaves your allies within the foundation able to say, hey, it's not that I'm saying it, but did you hear what Wanjiru said when she was here last week? We ought to really consider that. So those are some of those tactical approaches that I have found to be helpful. And I mean, I don't think I would be saying anything that is controversial, certainly from the colleagues at the Gates Foundation that I've worked with. I run an organization that's a grantee of the Gates Foundation, and I've also had opportunity to stand in front of foundation staff and say some really difficult things, things that were difficult to hear. But then it also starts to look really bad if you stop funding someone because they said some stuff. Like, that's just too petty. And in general, you hope you're working with adults. And in general, it's not always true. I think that is an approach for when you're working with foundation staff. Now, when you're working with the actual billionaires themselves, I haven't figured that out. And I have to admit that some of what is I think it's challenging, honestly. I think then it's a lot more about taking that individual on a learning journey, and it's a lot around building trust. It's not, I mean, I did it when I was running a Kavita with individual, they kind of Bay Area individuals, actually. That's a whole other story, actually, now that I remember this. Because that's where that piece that Kavita was talking about, intersectional feminism, here was a relatively young African woman running an organization and raising money from mostly wealthy white Bay Area women. For African girls. And a lot of times the narrative they had been used to hearing about African girls was what you said. I loved what you said. How do we get philanthropists to stand with rather than bestow upon? And there's just, for high net worth individuals, a narrative and a language and a training up in philanthropy that is you bestow upon. And I did find it.
So saving those poor African girls.
Girls, yeah. And I was doing that in a context where a couple of other folks were raising money for similar, I'm not going to name names. I'm sure Kavita will remember that context because we were in the Bay Area together. There were others raising money for those same poor African girls. And it was really difficult to say, no, I'm not going to come here and stand to tell you how you're going to save those orphans. What I'm going to stand here and tell you is, if you think I have a powerful voice and I've had amazing opportunities and I've done good with the opportunities that I've had, I need you to help me, and let's multiply the kind of opportunities that put me in front of you. Let's multiply that for a couple of thousand other powerful, high potential, articulate, amazing, brilliant young women who have a vision for how they want to transform their societies and their communities. It took a long time, but the message finally caught. And I do really believe that distinguished Akilidada from a lot of organizations that started at around the same time that were talking about girls' rights and girls' empowerment.
I don't think I need to add anything, Kathryn. And if you need to open up, feel free. Where both of us are happy to take questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you for these incredibly powerful responses. And just as, you know, an observer, I've seen the kind of transformative effect that both of you have had on individuals and on organizations. And that's really incredibly powerful to watch and to stand in solidarity with both of you. I'd like to introduce now Emily Anderson, Assistant Professor of Educational Policy at Florida International University, who's going to join us to facilitate the Q&A. And I can see from the chat that there are really incredible questions that we want to make sure we can begin to attend to. So Emily, we're excited.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. I'm sorry to speak over you, and thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. I apologize for not sharing my screen. There seems to be a little bit of tech issue there, but we're gonna keep moving. So some great conversations are happening in the chat, and it's my privilege to share some of those highlights that were introduced by our colleagues. And so one of the things that has come up in conversation is about the role and importance of critical pedagogy. to challenge inequality. And so as colleagues have shared, we need, in quotes, a green education to deal with climate change, and we need a peace education to confront war and violence. But there's also concerns raised by our colleagues about how such curricula is, quote, divided by class, caste, language, and location. And so for curricula to be the norm rather than the expectation, one of our colleagues suggests that government control over education will need to be grounded in equitable spaces. And so for the panelists, what do you think the role of curriculum is in the global philanthropy network, and where are those possibilities in those spaces, in the same way that you discussed possibilities for transnational activism as part of your larger work?
Wanjiru, I don't know if you would like to begin. I'm certainly happy to say a few words.
Go ahead.
I think the question of curriculum is hugely important, and we know that pedagogy, starting with Paulo Freire's, pedagogy of the oppressed, and our understanding about how, those in power basically develop curriculums to keep themselves in power, right? So those of us who grew up, both Wanjiru and myself, in societies that were previously colonized, we know very well the British had this like really worked out to a fine art, and they actually were very open about it. Lord Macaulay famously said, we want to create a class of Indians who are British in taste, British in understanding, British in education, in everything but the color of their skins. And so, so it came to be that we learned about daffodils before we had ever seen a daffodil in our lives. We had to learn Wordsworth and Shakespeare and all of this other stuff. We never learned really very much about our own traditions, our own writers, our own speakers. Black people in the United States have had a very similar experience. So it doesn't need to be external colonization. It can be the results of other forms of structural inequality. And Dalit writers and Dalit speakers and Dalit feminists inside India have been similarly excluded because of casteism in India. So I think the onus in some ways is for me twofold, right? In some ways, I think we took that education that we were given, whatever it was, however colonized it was, and we turned it into a spear that we could use to fight for our freedom. And I would say that very consciously, because it was not an accident that Gandhi was an educated lawyer who was educated in the British legal system to be able to kind of turn that. So there is a way in which, and I'm not saying that that should be our only hope, but I think of generations of feminists who came out of an extremely patriarchal form of education and yet actually redefined and re-challenged so that we actually had the means to turn that upside down. So that is one thing, which is the notion of using what we are given to subversive effect. And I think that requires different kinds of support, both inside and outside the classroom. But I would not want us to feel that we are only limited because a government doesn't allow us to influence the particulars of a curriculum. That said, of course, we should be fighting to affect and address curriculum, and whether philanthropy is the right place to make that difference or not. I think what philanthropy can do is lift up examples of different ways in which to do this. And I think that that is something, as Wanjiru just said in her example with Akili Dada, there are, whether we call it empowerment, which I no longer like to use that word because nobody ever is given power, you always take power. I think the question is that we then find ways in which we fight for curricula that actually speak about claiming our voice, agency, and power, whether it is as women, whether it is as people who've been otherwise marginalized from society. So let me hand it over to Wanjiru to add.
Yeah, I also, I just posted a link to a book just coming out by one of my friends from grad school called In the Street. And it really is, I think, one of the most powerful, most important reflections on what people call leaderless movements and the ways that they are transforming. They have been, continue to, and will continue to transform political dialogue, political discourse. So I've posted the link to Amazon on there. I highly recommend the book. The analysis, I think, is really solid in terms of the political moment. And I know I'm not answering the question, but it's a question that I saw in the chat. In terms of curriculum, I think the first and most important thing curriculum must do is to remind people, remind students, remind learners how we got here. And the contextualizing, placing in historical context, which I think Kavita did so well when she began her intervention, to how did we get here is always such an important thing. And I feel like if you can learn that, if curricula can help learners understand the historical trajectory, we get so much better at understanding and seeing possibilities beyond us. So whether it is understanding what the Pan-African anti-colonial movement did, and how we at the African Union today stand on the backs of Nyerere and Nkrumah, Kenyatta, and their vision for a unified Africa. That then helps us have a lot more interesting conversations about structural adjustment then and structural adjustment in its present day iteration, where a lot of our countries are, again, we're going right back to that mess. Kenya is heavily indebted. And I don't know if any of you saw this. Back to that question of the political moment, a really great example. The IMF World Bank annual meetings just happened. And at one of the press conferences, I don't know who organized this, but God bless them. A whole bunch of Kenyan activists basically took to the Facebook Live of that press conference and called out nonstop for the duration of that press conference, called out all the loans that are being given to Kenya and the kind of the democratic implications of that level of public indebtedness. And so I think it can be easy to assume that these are issues so complex the average citizen has no understanding of, but that's actually not true. It may not be true in other parts of the world, but the average African citizen is very aware because of what we've just come out of in terms of the decimation of the 80s of our public institutions and then of our democratic institutions and the work we had to do in the 90s to get our countries back. Your average Kenyan voter is incredibly aware of the national debt and how long it's going to take and how much we all owe as a result. Someone was asking, well, how the flame that was set alight in the Arab Spring. I think folks in other parts of the world are way more politically aware than folks in the West tend to be. And a lot of that is, I think, because of you build institutions. Who is it that said the price of democracy is eternal vigilance? And I think a lot of folks in the West forgot the eternal vigilance part. And for some of us, first the colonial moment, then the first post-colonial leaders of African countries and the failures there have triggered a level of vigilance around democratic rights that is important. And curriculum is, I think, part of that, and especially history.
Thank you so much for your responses. I think we have time for one last question, and so I'll invite Kathryn back to ask. Welcome, Kathryn.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily. So as Kavita so eloquently laid out for us, right, one of the principal critiques of philanthropy is that it's the transfer of wealth extracted through exploitation to then solve the problems created by the conditions of capitalism itself that allow for the wealth creation in the first place, and then does very little, right, to change those structural conditions. We know that there have been calls for a global corporate wealth tax and global taxation on wealth more generally by both Janet Yellen, by Thomas Piketty's work work, and what can we talk about? What if we were to move away from philanthropic donor-driven models and think about taxation as a core way to deal with inequity in the global political economy?
So I'm happy to say a few words about that. I have a lot of thoughts about that, and I'm sure Wanjiru will as well. I think in this, again, we cannot be sort of too starry-eyed about taxation either, right? So I think by which I simply mean that the ways in which the US tax dollar is currently used, the fact that such a huge percentage of every dollar goes to essentially support the military, one of the hugest military budgets of any nation in the world, the largest by a factor of 20 over the next closest competitor, which is China, is something that should give all of us pause, right? Because it is not enough to simply say, okay, now no more philanthropy, but let's just give all the money to the US government, and lovely, the US government will now spend, 40 cents on every dollar on the military, another 20 cents on police, and health, education, and childcare will all come in the remaining, whatever tiny bucket. So I think it requires going back to Wanjiru's point about democracy and really understanding to what extent are we able to hold our governments accountable. In the government of Pakistan, for example, 40 cents of every dollar currently goes to defense in a country which spends a pittance on education or health. So, I don't think taxation is automatically a response. I think the reason we think about it as a response is because we look at Western Europe, which again, I would like to submit that as long as Western Europe was primarily white and heterogeneous, it was great at creating all of these, very beneficial forms of social welfare projects. It is facing a lot more difficult challenges now that it is becoming a much more multiracial society. And in places like France, they don't even want to acknowledge. I mean, they don't want to even deal with critical race theory because they think this is a foreign American import, Quelle horreur that you should have to deal with white supremacy, which was, a French legacy from God knows how long. So I don't think taxation is an automatic response, in part because we do not have governments that actually share the same values as its citizens, or that necessarily want to put that wealth into the hands of citizens. That said, is it a more does it have slightly more accountability than private philanthropy? Absolutely it does. And absolutely, I strongly support much, much, much higher taxes. And I'm so encouraged by Biden actually having come forward with, I think all of us, I was so amused and charmed by AOC actually coming out and saying, wow, I'm really pleased and impressed with what he's doing. So I don't know whatever happened to him in this process. Bless him, and we're grateful for it. But I think what you can see is that this is not going to happen easily. Kathryn, you may have already noted that the IMF and the World Bank have come out strongly against the Yellen suggestion. And this is nonsense because, basically what they're saying is, oh, then this will stop foreign private investment in those countries. Foreign private investment in those countries is not making the world more equal for poor people in either Kenya or India or anywhere else in the world. This is not the basis on which we should be agreeing. So I think we do need a conversation on taxation, but I think we need a conversation on taxation that is grounded in a conversation about accountability and democracy that really reflects the people, as opposed to kind of, some nationalistic notion of, what are priorities.
I think there are two conversations to be had at on taxation. One is a primarily Western one, where, and one is, I think, a global South, if you will. One, I think the Western one around, should individuals have that much wealth, be able to accumulate that much wealth? I think that is a real question, a real conversation, and that the evolution of taxes, especially in the US, has created real challenges that ought to be addressed. I think when it comes to the global South, and here let me speak particularly to the Kenyan context, increased taxation for us is actually, so much of our tax is value-added tax, right? So 16% tax on every good sold, every commodity, every service. So if I go buy milk, a little packet of milk, it's 50 cents, but of that 50 cents, there's a 16% tax on that. And the impact of that on poor people is devastating, because that's the most retrogressive tax you could possibly have. And so those are very different conversations. We then also beyond that, before you have that conversation, is really a fundamental understanding, and this does kind of tie to that curriculum question, a fundamental understanding of the origin of the African state. The African state was not created by the people for the people. The African state is a colonial imposition. The very design of the African state is to extract resources from the grassroots and concentrate them at the top and send them to the metropole, send resources to the west, to the north. And so taxation, if you're not careful, taxation becomes, and has become in a lot of our countries, exactly an acceleration of that dynamic. I just posted a link to what I was referring to, the very awareness that Kenyans have of the implications of loans to governments on the tax realities on the ground for us. And we are not suffering from the same challenges of undertaxed billionaires in quite the same way that I think a lot of, certainly that the US seems to be suffering from. I'm not gonna sit here and say we need more billionaires, but we don't have too many yet.
Well, we in India, Wanjiru, we do, and they definitely need to be taxed. And as you can see, the current government is aligning themselves very closely with some of the biggest ones, and they are very deeply connected to this extraction industry, both Ambani and Adani, which are two of the biggest corporate billionaires in the Indian context. So, and just in the last, since quote unquote liberalization of the Indian economy in 1992, you've seen an explosion of billionaires, some allegedly 150 now already inside India. So I think we may have slightly different realities, but I agree with you that the legacy of the colonial state that many of us have inherited is very much based on this take from the peasants in the periphery, and have everything come to the metropole. And you see that in the kind of resources that cities like Delhi have in comparison to any other part of the country. So yes, you're right, the differences have to be understood. They're not one and the same, but neither do I think they are an automatic, even if they aren't the same. Our governments don't necessarily choose to use our taxes in the ways that we might want for the best outcomes of the people. So that's also something to think about.
Thank you so much to both of you for your brilliant responses and for your provocations. And I think you're going to leave all of us thinking throughout the day and throughout this week and into our work lives about these really big questions. And I appreciate the boldness of the ways in which both of you think, and for your time and for sharing with all of us. I'll turn it over now to Kathryn Muller.
And I also want to thank both of you for lots of food for thought, lots of things that I'm sure will carry us through the week and beyond. And thank you to Kathryn for chairing, and the audience for your great comments in the chat and the Q&A. And thank you again to our ASL interpreters, Kyle and Rodney. We do have to end on time, so I hope to see all of you in this other plenary sessions tomorrow and the next day, same time, and all of the other sessions. We have a great program. So thank you very much, Kavita and Wanjiru.
Thank you so much.